generic definition of wildlife. Wildlife is a lot of different species, and I know a lot of people, when they think about wildlife, they think about the game species, deer, turkey, grouse, but in fact, there are a lot of other kinds, and that's where a lot of the subtleties come in. Each one has its own habitat requirements, life history requirements, and each one kind of perceives the landscape at their own scale. Some of them are specialists, some of them are generalists. So for example, if you look at this, if you look from clear cuts up to mature forest, some species will be more abundant in clear cuts, others don't care that much, and some are much more abundant or only occur in mature forests. So birds are actually a really great way to talk about this because they actually read the book as opposed to some other kinds of animals. Is anybody here a bird watcher? Yeah, so you know they read the book. So wildlife species diversity reflects diverse conditions on the landscape within stands and also at the larger landscape level. As I mentioned before, there are species that pretty much only occur in mature forests, others that pretty much only occur in young forests. Some, like grouse, have to have the dense sapling stage as the forests change from young to more mature as cover. Then there's some that like grassy, only like grassy or open fields, or they basically are affiliated with that, such as bobwhite quail and meadowlarks. There's some animals that need wetlands, such as some kinds of salamanders, and there's elevational considerations. Golden-winged warblers like earlier successional habitat, but only at higher elevations. And site productivity. Some birds like richer sites compared to drier sites. So in our area, and when I talk, I'm mostly talking about upland hardwood forest because that's where I do most of my work these days, is in southern Appalachians. So it's maybe a little less applicable to the pine areas in Alabama. But no species has to have old growth. There are some that are definitely affiliated with mature forest conditions, but old growth, the pristine, untouched, in our area, there's nothing that has to have that. Although mature forest is important and larger tracts of mature forest is important for some species. They're not going to occur in edgy habitat or young forest habitat. There's a lot that are generalists that can pretty much live wherever there's woods and fields and open areas. And then there are some that there are actually a lot of birds in particular that require early successional habitats. So I got really interested in historical disturbances and how populations might have occurred historically on the landscape if only natural disturbances would have disturbed them. And the reason is because the National Forest, I work for the National Forest Service in the research branch as opposed to the management branch. They have been told in their planning rules for planning how to manage the national forest that they're supposed to consider the ecological integrity of forests, which means you have to know the historic range of variation of natural disturbances. How big were they? What kind were they? How frequent were they? And they have to at least consider managing them on that basis. Now, private landowners don't have to do that, but it's still very interesting to think about. So how were they created? What was the first of all, what would be the reference condition of what an untouched landscape with only natural disturbances? Well, you think, well, maybe before humans were here. Well, before humans were here was about 12,000 years ago, because that's when humans started moving into the area. And at that time, the glaciers were also much further south. They weren't this far south, but they were much further south, which made the climate around here much colder. So where I live, and it looks like right around here also, this was mainly boreal forest and tundra. So to call the reference condition pre-human doesn't really work because it was a completely different landscape at that time. And then a completely different set of animals lived here too, of course, because the habitat was different. So we had, giant ground sloths and mastodons and mammoths and all kinds of crazy things here on this landscape. It would have been like a moonscape to us if we could stand in Google Earth and watch things change over 12,000 years. It would have been really amazing. And so humans, when they first came here, of course, they probably didn't have a huge impact on the landscape. They were small in number, and they probably traveled in small groups. But over the course of that 12,000 years, the climate changed. So the glaciers retreated, and the climate warmed up, and so the forest became the temperate forest that we know today. So of course the animals changed as well. And during that period, and today, the natural disturbances and the kinds of forests that we know in the hardwood forest range from gap dynamics, which is the occasional death of a tree here and there, drought, windstorms, tornadoes, ice storms, insect outbreaks, fire, landslides. But what kind of natural disturbances are the most prevalent varies, and I'm mainly talking about the Central Hardwood Region, which we are in right now, but so I'm not focusing on the coastal plain or the Piedmont. So some kinds of natural disturbances are more prevalent toward the west, such as tornadoes and frequency of burning, natural burning, and then others such as hurricanes or hurricane-associated winds or landslides are much more common toward the east or the north, depending on the topography and how the climate changes as you go north. But the prevalent kinds of natural disturbances differ among ecosystems. So, for example, in sandpine scrub, which is the southern part of Alabama, has a little bit of this, as does the panhandle of Florida. Otherwise, it's kind of a unique ecosystem. But there, it has low frequency fire, but when it burns, it nails it. It just it kills everything above ground. And then slowly, or actually rather quickly, everything underground is still alive. So it sprouts back very quickly, and the sandpine, which is serotinous, the cones are serotinous, so they only open after a burn. They shed their seeds right after a burn, because the wax melts, and then everything grows up like from ashes from the phoenix. So that's in one particular ecosystem. In another one, which you guys are probably more familiar with, the longleaf pine sandhills, the natural fire regime was probably fairly frequent every 3 to 5 years, but there's never an exact regimen. I'm sure it went 10 years or 20 years sometimes in places. And the fire intensity would be low because the fuel, which is the wiregrass mainly, is low, and it carries it over long, long distances. So that helped with the frequency too, as once it was set, it could go for long areas. But in the upland hardwood system, it's yet a little bit different. Single tree mortality or gap dynamics, which is the occasional death of a tree, about 1% a year is what they say, is kind of the background natural disturbance. But drought sometimes happens, which can kind of accelerate that background gap dynamics and make the gap dynamics happen a little more than 1%. For example, oak decline is precipitated partly by drought. Oak decline is the gradual dieback of oak trees, primarily the scarlet oak and the red oak group, and it occurs much more often in areas that have low site quality and aging trees. So it's kind of a combination of things, and it's basically the slow death of oak. And it can affect small areas or huge areas, partly dependent on not only the drought that precipitates it, the age of the class, but also if there's a lot of oaks, it's going to have a bigger impact. If there aren't many oaks there, it's going to have a smaller impact. The southern pine beetle also is often precipitated by drought, so it comes in pulses, usually associated with droughts. And outbreaks occur about every 7 to 25 years. Less often in the mountains and less impact in the mountains because there aren't as many pines, but nonetheless it's a kind of a natural disturbance. They are a natural species. Landslides are another one that occur mainly in pulses when there's heavy rains every few decades, and then they happen just a lot of them around the same time. Ice storms, more at high elevations, and they cause a gradient of disturbance. So all of these, it's not like, well, something happened, so now it's basically the same thing as a clear cut. Obviously, it's a gradient of disturbances. So ice storms, for example, can knock down trees over large areas, or it can just knock down the branches, letting more light in on the forest floor, which can affect the regeneration underneath. So it's like a gradient of conditions. It's not like, yes, it's early successional, or no, it's not early successional. And wind disturbance, of course. Lots of different kinds, and they can affect small to large areas. Hurricane-related winds, hurricanes hit the hardest on the coast, obviously, but as the winds move inland, they can cause a great deal of damage still. By then, it's called tropical storms. But as you can see here, these are some of the national forests in the south. So as you get the hardwood ones up in the mountains, for example, the Cherokees in Tennessee, Pisgahs in North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky. There you have the lower intensity, the H1 winds, somewhat often. It's not really all that infrequent, but still they're lower intensity. Whereas some of the ones on the coast have many more of them because the hurricanes are moving in, the winds are still high, and they also have some of the higher intensity hurricanes. So here you can see why, as I said, some of the ones on the coast are going to get hit more frequently, and the ones inland are going to have lower intensity winds, but they still can do a lot of damage. Tornadoes, less frequent in some areas compared to others, and the amount of damage also depends on how long the track's on the ground or whether it's skipping, and how wide the track is and for how long it goes. But it can cause quite a bit of damage, thousands of acres as well. And in a gradient of like maybe half the trees will be knocked down, but half of them are standing. So it's not just gone. It creates a range of conditions. Lightning in the hardwood region historically was probably not all that common because lightning is usually accompanied by rain. The hardwoods tend to be moist. It's hard to get enough fuels in hardwoods, only in certain topographic positions, really low quality sites where a lot of mountain laurel grows, but much of the time there's probably not enough fuel to have frequent fires the way you might have in the coastal plain. So we actually looked at the records of the national forests of the cause of fires in the hardwood region. And here's the Bankhead, that's in Alabama, I do believe. But most of these are hardwood forests, and you can see the lightning-caused fires do happen, but they cause a tiny fraction of the fires compared to human-caused fires, whether it's abandoned campfires or cigarette butts or whatever it is. So really, fire as a natural, if you're calling non-human natural, wasn't all that common in the hardwood region, most likely. And looks like my caption's missing on this, how odd. But animals also are a natural disturbance. So in the past, we had passenger pigeons, which would be millions of pounds sitting in the branches in giant flocks. They would break branches and cause disturbances. Elk and bison were here in our area also, and they probably helped to maintain grassy areas, but I suspect they also might have been here because humans burned so much and created habitat for them, which allowed them to be here in much greater numbers than they might be otherwise. And of course, beaver, I heard a lot of talk about beaver today, used to create much higher populations than now, and they would create these large areas that were flooded and served as early successional habitat. But another piece that was here for those 12,000 years, including when these forests became as they are today, was humans. And humans the population of Native Americans is closely correlated with the frequency of fires. They used fire to clear for ag fields. They would kill the trees through girdling them with fire. They cleared for villages. They did it to manage for game. All kinds of reasons why they used fire, and they used it frequently. So they were creating a lot of early successional habitats. By 3,000 years ago, this is before Euro-American influence, they had villages, gardens. They made lots of agriculture, and then when the fields became low productivity, they would abandon them and move on. And so they had a mosaic of age classes because the old abandoned fields would turn back into forests. So they had a lot of structural diversity wherever humans had their imprints. And I dug up this map of an archaeologist these are the dark black is the known places where humans were. This is in the year 1500, so it was documented for sure they were in those areas. And then the grayer area is the footprint, so they burned beyond their villages, or they had abandoned villages, or whatever. So they were impacting 7% of the landscape directly, and this is before Euro-American humans were here, and up to 43% indirectly. So, and when the earliest Euro-Americans came through, which is our only real accounts, written accounts, they described a very different landscape than we see today. They talked about the vast savannas and the big expanses of cultivated fields, and there were woods beyond that, so it wasn't like humans were impacting every inch, every moment, but there were definitely early successional habitats created by humans. And then Euro-Americans also were a huge disturbance and continued some of the same practices, but probably expanded them. They used fire a lot. They let their livestock range free, and they had to burn the woods to create more forage for them, and they used it for agriculture. And then, of course, there was extensive logging here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where the landscapes were basically stripped bare. There was no sustainable management back then. They were just getting the logs for money, and then they were abandoned. So that after that, there was they had trains going through to take the logs out. The sparks would cause these huge fires, and just very bad land management practices. And then, of course, we've also introduced a lot of non-native pathogen and pests. We've managed to kill our American chestnut, gypsy moth, and all kinds of stuff that'll have huge impacts on our landscape today, but also create early successional habitat to some extent. And then, of course, urban sprawl doesn't benefit much at all. And not much lives in urban sprawl except for starlings and house sparrows and non-native plant species and humans. So what is early successional habitat? It's not even necessarily successional. The term early successional basically means a change from, pasture, for example, through the encroachment of pine, and under the pine, which creates shade, up comes the hardwoods. This really isn't, people use the term very loosely, and I don't even like the term successional, but nonetheless, people understand it. So it can be pretty much, ag fields, it can be meadows, it can be open forests, it can be severely burned areas, it can be places knocked down by hurricanes, and so on. So there's a lot of gradient of what counts as early successional habitat. And in each one of those conditions, you're going to find your own set of species that prefer it. As I mentioned before, the quail, field sparrow, grasshopper sparrow are going to be in the grassy areas. You're not going to find them in a young forest that was just cut and sprouting back. It's completely different than a young forest. It's different from a meadow. Golden-winged warblers, same kind of thing, but at higher elevations. The song sparrows and mockingbirds are in your gardens. They love to be around human-type habitats. Rough grouse in the denser thickets for their young, at least, and so on and so forth. So there's different kinds. And a lot of these kinds were created by humans, and probably have historically been created by humans for a long time, because some of these could not be created by natural disturbances, at least not very often. For example, what kind of natural disturbance is going to create a pasture or an agricultural field or an old field or a garden, and so on. So I think humans probably have always been a keystone species in creating early successional habitats along with natural disturbances. And probably populations of these early succession dependent species ebbed and flowed as the availability of these habitats changed over time. So what does this have to do with management? Well, landowners can create early successional habitat if they want to through a lot of different methods, forestry methods, if you're doing forestry anyway. One would be, depending on what kinds you want, single tree selection probably doesn't really create technically early successional habitat from the perception of an animal, but nonetheless it could be done. Group selection creates groups of small openings. Femelschlag is one that we're researching where I work now, which is basically an expanding gap thing where some of the intermediate species like oak grow in intermediate light conditions around the edges of an opening, don't grow so well in the middle because there's too much competition from faster growing species like yellow poplar. So if you want oak and hickory, it's going to be at the edges, and so you do that for 10 years and then you expand the gap and release the oak, and hopefully the idea is to get more intermediate species and structural diversity over time. So Femelschlag is one possibility. Clear cutting might be good for some species. Hot prescribed burning. We're doing some studies on burn severity and also season of burn where I work. And I don't think you probably want to do this as landowners, but if you have a very hot fire and it kills a lot of trees, it's going to have a huge change on the wildlife community because the early successional species come flooding in, but the later successional species stay there because there's still some vertical structure there that they like. Same thing with shelter woods. So, one thing we've researched for a while is how native fruits respond to big openings. And this is mature forest, both briar and cove hardwood forest, which is moister and more higher productivity. If you cut a forest, which we did, then the fruit productivity goes like up to 20 times higher. And these were shelter woods within the first year or two, and lasts for a while. And then I skipped a few years here, but by year 10, it's gone back down to what it was in the mature forest. So huge patches of food source for animals. And that is mainly due to the fact that the shrubs come in, the blackberry and the pioneer species, pokeweed, come in, but also some of the species that were cut, if they're sprouting back, they produce fruit too. And some of them are undesirables in most foresters' minds. Here, I might add persimmon, or some of the ones that you have here. This is the mountains where I am, which doesn't have too much persimmon. But all these species produce soft mast, as people call it, which is good for animals. And generally speaking, the more light there is, the more response you're going to get from the fleshy fruit-producing species. The reason it goes down over time, after several years, is the canopy's closing in, the light's gone, and some of these pioneer species, like the pokeweed and the blackberry, get shaded out. Another thing to consider, if you're, how much time do I have? We're there, okay. Another thing that is patch size. Some animals need small patches and some need big patches of early successional or not early successional, and you can cut in patterns to create more large areas or not, and arrange your habitats. And also you got to remember that it changes over time, and forests do recover and become mature again. So basically that's it. When you're managing your land, think about spatial patterns and temporal patterns